Can you hear me now? Okay. Well, welcome to this closing session. The aim of this session is to look back to some extent, but also look forward. But first, I would like to toast with all of you on the conference. So, cheers.
Cheers.
It was a wonderful, I think, experience, despite some of the difficulties we had with the platform, the connections, and all of that. But I'm personally quite happy with the result and all the interactions I've seen. Of course, we have been thinking about this a long time, but now to see it in action is really rewarding. This session is mainly about reporting. So people will report some results. We will ask people first to talk about the networking sessions. And then we asked some representatives of the networks and associations that have supported this conference to say a few things about how they experienced it and how they would like to take it forward. And then we will end with a number of possible ideas, suggestions, and please use the chat to add your ideas. So everyone in the audience, you can comment on what you hear, you can add, and of course you're also welcome to take initiatives yourself and connect up. So we first start with the networking sessions to hear from them. And I think, Jonas, you were the first one to report on the experimentation and evaluation networking sessions. So
yes, thank you. Thank you so much. We had two of the sessions with relatively small attendance, unfortunately, but the discussions there ended up being quite deep as a result. What I noticed from those conversations was a sense of this continuous proliferation and diversification of the kinds of experiments that are associated with transformative innovation policy. I did notice that there is kind of more widespread usage of a common language around experimentation and evaluation in particular, which I think is the result of some of the recent publications around transformative outcomes, but also the formative evaluation papers that came through TIPC. However, I wonder if behind this common language, there isn't still a lot more diversity in how those things are becoming operationalized. And I think we need some more comparative studies to be able to see that. I also noticed in those conversations a growing awareness about the different capacities that are necessary for designing, conducting, and evaluating experiments, and an emphasis on the processes that have to happen to, if you want to update organizational and bureaucratic cultures, and the sort of tensions of trying to do experimentation from within systems that are not so used to doing so. One example of that was particularly in relation to missions that I think are more and more sort of becoming a hybrid object between transformative innovation policy and other narratives of innovation policy. I also noticed a beginning of a common ground around the need to evaluate experiments using sort of other approaches than more summative ways, and this was visible both in the networking sessions but throughout the conference. Here there was a lot more emphasis on the quality of co-creation and participation, the reflexivity that's necessary to kind of challenge perceived preconceptions, and a sense that the evaluation itself is undergoing experimentation. We need to experiment with different ways of doing evaluation, as we saw throughout the conference. I do think there is a recognition that those frameworks are very useful, but there's also a sense that there is a lot that is happening that doesn't necessarily use those frameworks. And I would say that evaluation and experimentation are part of building the knowledge basis for transformative innovation policy. And in particular, I thought very important the intervention from Philippe Larue in the session about the need to really develop the kind of evidence base behind transformative innovation policy to avoid the potential backlash against adopting those narratives with gusto when that evidence base is not quite there. So evaluation and experimentation will probably contribute to developing that knowledge basis and evidence basis moving forward. So thank you for all of you that participated in the network sessions, and I hand over to you, Dipashi. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Jonas. Yeah, so I'm going to talk about the table which was talking about the knowledge infrastructure on transformation. So in that table, I would say, again, the participation was quite, I would say, at a personal level. So at some points, I could even talk one-to-one to some of you. So I would like to start by thanking those of you who have joined that networking table. And the idea of the networking table is obviously also to know each other a bit more. So as you can see in this slide, we did talk about knowledge infrastructure. We did raise some questions about knowledge infrastructure and also some clarifications after we had the plenary on Wednesday. But the highlights you would see that are often less about knowledge, often kind of indirectly related to knowledge infrastructure. So we did talk a lot more. I think the kind of variety of discussion in that table was a lot more kind of diverse. So yes, we did. I think in the beginning, in the first few days, the main questions was about the definitions, about the kind of boundary of knowledge infrastructure, and also this distinction between, okay, we are going to create a new infrastructure. How is it different from existing infrastructures? And how can we then mobilize existing infrastructures? So I think there was a lot of questioning of why we need a new infrastructure and what we even mean by infrastructure. And then the third question was more about the kind of practicalities and the logistics of having an infrastructure. So how does a knowledge infrastructure for transformation look like in practice? And then the question of, okay, what is included within building an infrastructure and what is outside of an infrastructure? So how can we actually operationalize this rather broad concept? And I think within the highlights, I think I really appreciated the conversation around this sort of networks as an infrastructure. So we did talk a lot in the initial first 2 days about this sort of niche networks, and especially transdisciplinary networks, and the importance of these importance of researcher policymaker network in the global south and also in the global north and elsewhere. So we did generalize, but then we were talking very specifically about agroecological niches in the south. And then we were talking about portfolio of niches. So there are multiple niches and how to sort of monitor and scale niches. Again, infrastructure for scaling. Then we also had a discussion about spaces for informal learning, and this is connecting to the knowledge organization topic. So we did had a session about this role of knowledge organization, and we're following up from that role of knowledge organization in learning. We talked about, okay, how can universities create space for mixing not just formal education, formal ways of learning, but also informal learning. On one of the days, we had a very nice which touched on this idea of open science and open access. Of course, this is part of the infrastructure discussion. Often it is also one of the things that immediately comes to mind when we think about infrastructure or research infrastructure. It's about accessibility of science, open science. So I did come across this nice sort of open science framework that could be connected to, and that we can sort of adapt in terms of having this infrastructure for TIP, talking about inclusivity, transparency, reproducibility of the science. And finally, I think in several of the days, I had the discussion about funding, which is really important in terms of supporting these infrastructures. So how to really find existing funding that support this sort of new kind of knowledge that we are trying to create, and also lobby for future funding schemes that can support the design principles that we are trying to build, right? So transparency, transdisciplinarity, accessibility, and also sustainability of this knowledge infrastructure. How can funding, research funding, support that? So these are some of the things I just wanted to sort of mention, and maybe I kind of missed some of the points, but I really thought this was really a lot of points to cover and a lot of points to think about going forward. Thank you all for the contribution in that table. So I think I'm going to hand over to Erika for her contribution on the conceptualization of transformative change table.
Hello? I hope you can hear me now. Yes? Great. Yes, so our session was called Conceptualization of Innovation for Transformative Change. And there were 2 simultaneous sessions allocated to this topic, but we soon realized that that given the number of participants, it made more sense to merge both sessions. We had, say, an average of about 4 or 5 participants in each of the sessions, and it may sound like a small number, but we ended up for networking, but we ended up having building up and deepening our conversation and discussion throughout the week. It is more or less the same people roughly joined every day, and then each day we could pick it up where we left it and the day before. So for me, these discussions have been really an inspiration, and several of us consider them to be one of the highlights of the week. The participants in this session came from different disciplinary backgrounds, but had a common interest in pushing the boundaries of the conceptual frameworks they usually work with. And in some cases, the academic trajectory had exposed them to groups working with different frameworks, and this in some way had planted a seed to look further. And I think this is an important point that I take out of the networking sessions, that it's important to find those that are working with different conceptual tools, but are open to walk. I think it was used this expression in our discussions, to walk in the margins of the conceptual comfort zones and start having these meaningful conversations with the contributions from other theoretical frameworks. So in our case, we explore the possibilities of looking at the complementarities between innovation systems, socio-technical systems, and sustainability transitions. And we agreed on the need to move beyond the mere recognition that conceptual integration needs to happen, to dig into the how, and which aspects specifically, and how the context may demand revisiting some of the concepts and adding new conceptual considerations and stretching some of these concepts. So this is part of what kept us busy over the course of the week. And if I can describe it this way, that it seems to me that there is an appetite to get into the nitty-gritty conceptual theory integration type of things. And some of the questions that emerged through our discussion were, for instance, how do we conceptualize the capabilities of niches for transformative change? How do we bring in cultural dimensions more effectively into the conceptualization of transformative change? the regional and territorial considerations. What do they offer to demarcate what is the most appropriate space to define transformative change and transformative innovation? So these were some of the questions that kept us talking this week, and we shared information about teams contributing to these issues in different parts of the world. We share information about projects that are partially dealing with some of the gaps that we identify and some of the networks that we are involved in. How do we take this further was the question that we posed. And some of the ideas that were proposed were a concrete one was to organize, for instance, workshops with emerging scholars or PhD students or early career academics that have experimented perhaps with theory integration to really get into that level of detail that we think is necessary to as a next step. Another idea was to support the mobility of people at different stages in their careers, PhD or student exchanges, the mobility of more senior scholars, understanding that having these meaningful advances in theory integration takes time and requires people to interact. There was also the idea to engage the leadership of the different networks that have participated in this event to discuss ways in which the different networks can support specific activities that may help with these conceptual advances that we saw. But just to conclude, I think this type of spaces for exchange and deepening are extremely valuable. And again, I would like to thank all the participants for making these sessions so interesting and so engaging.
Yes, hello, it's Matthias Weber speaking here, and I was hosting the networking session dealing with policy and governance for transformative change. As for the other networking sessions, there was not a very vast number of participants, but contrary to what Erika just said, we had different participants every day. But if there was an idea that was cutting across the discussion that we had in this networking session, then it was that there was a lot of concern about the relationship between the old and the new, the old style of governance and the new style of governance. But it also seemed that what seems to be prevailing very often is a kind of rather dialectic thinking. So we tend to oppose national systems of innovation kind of policy or inspired policy with transformative innovation policy, tend to oppose niches to incumbents. And in many cases, this shows that there are very fundamental ways underpinning our lines of thought about how we believe that systems change, how change comes about. And it's a matter of whether we want to create new systems or whether we rather need to think about changing existing ones, or rather a mix of both. And let's say more concretely, this is reflected in 3 items that I would like to raise as some of the outcomes from our discussion. The first one refers to the relationship between classical and more transformative innovation policy. And one can say that from the exchanges that we had, there seems to be a tendency that new forms of transformative innovation policy is actually created in smaller spaces with the help of exploratory studies, rather experimental programs. And the question then often is, now after some first years of experience with transformative, more transformation-oriented programs, the question is then how to rather mainstream that kind of approach in the more wider space of innovation policy that is out there. So we are not doing transformative innovation policy in a vacuum, but it is part of a wider portfolio of innovation policy elements that are not necessarily transformative in the sense that we understand it. And there were actually some quite interesting examples of these kind of more, if you like, hybrid initiatives that are taking some inspiration from transformative thinking, but connect also or influence some of the kind of more dominant models of how innovation policy is practiced. For instance, I cannot go into details, but from South Africa or from Finland or from Austria, there have been some quite nice examples. So, and this points out that we may need to deal a bit more with questions of how innovation policy is also transformed from within the prevailing or dominating practices of innovation policy. The second point is, I think, that we also need to think more about how to reconfigure governance level playing fields, and where, for instance, missions, but also cities and regions are spaces where connections can be made between different policy fields more easily. And so this idea of creating new such governance playing fields. And the third idea that was discussed was more relating to finance, where the question is also about how new forms of finance can be mobilized in countries where traditional banking sectors may not be particularly open to transformative initiatives, where, for instance, crowdsourcing initiatives can be interesting elements to explore further. So I'll stop here and hand over to Anne for the last part.
Can you hear me? Can you hear me, everybody? Please okay, thank you. I'm looking at transformation from global south perspective. We had not so many had quite from any resources, artificial intelligence, finances, gender, capacity building, as well as other aspects of but all of them kind of sessions.
Well, I guess we are already moving to the second part now, if I understand this correctly, because Anne is having problems with her connection. So, following what Johan announced at the beginning, I think I'll move to the second part of the closing session. I think, can you confirm? I think that's how we are going to proceed now. So I will start with adding some perspective from the angle of the different networks that have been supporting this conference in various forms. And I'm going to speak on behalf of the Eu-SPRI network. Eu-SPRI is the European Forum for the Study of Policies on Research and Innovation. And it has been quite active in the inter-network dialogue that was actually preceding the organization at this conference, and has a strong interest in transformative innovation policy. But as it is a kind of scholarly community of mainly researchers, but also practitioners dealing with research and innovation policy matters in Europe, it also addresses, of course, many other facets of R&I policy. But what we have seen over the past years is this kind of growing interest in transformative innovation policy, where also in Eu-SPRI we have set on to engage with other disciplines, more with practitioners, and in particular also to engage in a more intensive dialogue with also sectoral policy fora, because transformative innovation policy requires very much this interaction. And that's, of course, also facilitated in EU-SPRI in particular by the fact that many of the academics organized in the EU-SPRI community also maintain close relationships with policymakers or having advisory roles to government as well. And from that angle, there are also other concepts that come into play and that I think are about to be explored at the intersection between transformative innovation policy and concepts like responsible research and innovation or tentative governance, where there is a kind of strong movement within EU-SPRI to continue the work on TIP. So I think in the follow-up to the conference, there will be certainly possibilities to, on the one hand, learn from the innovation journey that the conference itself went through in terms of the practice of organizing such an interactive conference, but also trying to see how we can connect to the knowledge infrastructure that we've been debating quite intensely over the past years. And from the perspective of EU-SPRI, which is maintaining a number of formats to provide elements that could be useful for a knowledge infrastructure, also from a kind of transformative innovation policy perspective. There are some of these elements in place within EU-SPRI that could be mobilized for the purposes of TIP, of our TIP network, of our TIP community, like the early career conferences, the exchange programs. We had an early career conference in autumn on transformative innovation policy. There is also quite a lot of work going on in EU-SPRI on new forms of indicator development, of monitoring, of formative processes to underpin the governance of transformative innovation policy. And these are elements that I think can be brought to bear also in the knowledge infrastructure that this community on transformative innovation policy is keen to advance, and that TIPC has already been referring to before. So there is certainly going to be further engagement of EU-SPRI around this community, and I hope that this will be the same for the other networks as well. And with this, I guess I hand over again to Erika for her perspective from the Globalists angle.
Hello again. Yes, thanks for the opportunity to speak about how do I see my personal views about the experience so far, and also as a member of Globalists. So Globalists reaches now its 20-year anniversary this year, and it would be impossible to summarize what the network offers to theory and practice in innovation for transformative change. But I would like to very quickly describe, in my own personal view, what I think are some of the assets and strengths of the network in the context of the efforts of building a knowledge infrastructure along the lines envisioned by this inter-network dialogue over the past years, and which takes us to this conference. So a lot of their work within Globalists has been inspired by scholars such as Chris Freeman, Dick Nelson, Bentoke Lundvall, and many other contributors from the Global South, Carlota Perez, Judith Sutz, Gabriela Dutrenit, and many others. One of the main outcomes of having scholars from the Global South playing such a key role in the ideas that have been formed within this network is the acceptance without reservation that innovation must work for development. And the idea that this development has to be inclusive and that it has to be sustainable. This departure point is very important because it has already forced raising questions that have helped, I think, advance the original concepts linked to innovation systems around learning capabilities and even long-term transformation perspectives, techno-economic paradigms, and so on. So starting from the departure point of innovation as working for development already pushes the boundaries of these conceptual contributions of the original literature. And we have research teams and individuals in various parts of the world within Globalists that continue to make conceptual and empirical contributions that speak to the realities of the Global South. And I think if one can say that very clearly is that Globalists has given a true voice to scholarship from the Global South. And connected to this, it has a regional knowledge infrastructure where regional networks are able to delve into the implications of the context, the regional aspects, the local aspects, and develop insights that speak to the reality. And here we had the African chapter of Globalists, AfricaLeaks, that has been discussing the role in convening the innovation and development community in Africa. And then we have the global infrastructure that allows for this conversation across regions. Which I think is extremely valuable. So it would be very interesting to see how the different regional networks can engage with the efforts initiated in this platform and connecting more concretely with transformative innovation policy and innovation for transformative change ideas, raising all of these region-specific questions. I think if I conclude, it's that with some views is that studies within Globalists are very diverse and very dynamic, and we're seeing new themes and disciplinary approaches finding the way into the literature that emerges from this network. And you can look at the thematic coverage of the conferences as a good example of this. You see more conventional thematic tracks on STI policy and practice, innovation management and entrepreneurship, alongside agriculture innovation systems, the green economy, sustainability, inclusion, and more recently issues around systems change, speaking more directly to innovation for transformative change as a thematic track. So we're pushing into the new themes and pushing the reach of the theoretical frameworks we're using to seek complementarities with other theoretical traditions. And here is where I see this conversation having a lot of value, and it would be great to advance it. And I think just to conclude, the impact that the Globalists has had on capacity building through the academies, the networking events, which has been a major contribution over the years, and collaborative workshops, carving space for substantial discussions could be beneficial for in the light of capacity building. From my own experience, having been engaged in the network, in this inter-network dialogue, alongside other Globalists members, it has been very enriching, and I hope we can continue to engage substantially and meaningfully to address all of this that we deeply care about.
So, hello, my name is Katarina, and I am here to represent the STRN, the Sustainability Transitions Research Network. And I would just like to, first of all, latch on to Erica's words and say it has been a really enriching conference, also from my own personal experience here. And the STRN, I'm very active in the STRN. I'm currently a steering group member of the STRN. I was last year's International Sustainability Transitions Conference lead organizer, and I am especially active in the thematic groups focused on agri-food transitions and on transitions in the Global South. So we have put together some thoughts concerning STRN's involvement with TIP, with TIPC, and with the other networks here at the conference. I think it's been really enriching, especially because much of STRN work has historically been and continues to be focused in a global North perspective. And it's been really great over the last week interacting so much with people from the AfricaLeaks, from Globalists, and also from the TIPC transformative hubs in Latin America and all of these global aspects. Now, STRN is, of course, also has a global perspective and has global members everywhere, but it was really great to connect with practitioners from all of the different networks here this week. The STRN and TIPC have a lot in common. I mean, the TIP approach is based on transitions theory, and there's a lot of strong conceptual and personal ties between TIPC and between the STRN communities. And so for future possibilities for collaboration, we saw two main points. Number one, which is bridging networks. And number two, we also saw some avenues for future collaborations. So concerning bridging networks, the STRN has a research agenda. Well, we've published 2 research agendas. Other authors have published 2 research agendas from the STRN. And as TIPC goes through the process of also focusing its research agenda, I think it would be interesting to also maybe there's something to learn from the STRN process or from the STRN research agendas. We can also see another point in network building through joint events, for example, from TIPC, who already have the learning series, and with some of the STRN thematic groups, for example, on urban transitions or on methods, or also, of course, the Global South that I was just mentioning. And of course, in the conferences, that we strengthen inter-network dialogues in the conferences, for example, which already happened in the 2021 International Sustainability Transitions Conference, which had a dedicated TIPC session. For looking for avenues for future collaboration, STRN runs a methods school, which I think it would be really interesting to also integrate these TIPC bottom-up reflective participatory methods that we've been experimenting with also this week. Some of the STRN researchers also do work like this, particularly the Drift Institute in Rotterdam. So bringing some of those really co-creation methods in would be a great way forwards. And looking at policy level engagements, the STRN and socio-technical transitions work has been taken up recently at very high level EU engagements. And we can see coordination between TIPC's work and STRN's work be really a good place to strengthen policy engagement as we go forward together. So thank you.
Good evening, and hope everyone can hear me. Just going to make some short comments, but from the perspective of a TIPC founding member and not one of the research networks. There's 4 reflections that I want to make. The first is that I think that building on what Papeshi said, there's no doubt that we need to be building a knowledge infrastructure. And I think that the networking sessions identified some useful design principles for that knowledge infrastructure. I think the critical issue moving forward, and as we think about the next phase of the TIPC and the involvement of the various networks here, is just who builds this knowledge infrastructure and how is this knowledge infrastructure governed. I think some of those issues need to be addressed and taken forward if we want to ensure a long-term sustainable knowledge infrastructure. I think there's some good ideas around its form and shape, but in terms of being practical around how to take it forward, there needs to be some kind of reflection, and hopefully we can do some of this as part of the TIPC governing board meeting, or even an engagement that goes broader than the TIPC. The second comment that I wanted to raise, kind of a reflection on this conference, and I think Erica summarized it well, that there were kind of 2 types of sessions, one around some of the fundamental aspects on conceptualizations around innovation policy, etc. But there were also areas of focus or sites of experimentation where there were some kind of discussions on what is happening in that space. And I think moving forward, linked to the knowledge infrastructure, what I found might become a useful way of drawing in people and attracting people to the kind of work and to continue is to think about some kind of clustering around the experimentation. I think at the moment we've over the last few years we've developed a number of sites, a number of niches, etc., but haven't organized this in a way that allows much more easier networking, particularly at the policy level. I don't think it's a problem at the academic level, but amongst the policy level. My own experience in terms of attracting people to this kind of a conference has been quite difficult. People wanting to participate, but they have their work, and if there are sets of clusters focusing on mobility or energy transitions, then that might make it easy to build and to deepen some of the work. The third comment that I wanted to make was that I found it quite useful, this conference, as opposed to previous ones, where there's been a greater emphasis, or there's been a lot more discussion around the social. I mean, I find this in South Africa, we have something called an economic cluster and a social cluster of ministers, and the kind of economic cluster tends to dominate, cabinet strategic sessions, etc. But that interface with kind of social policy and the kind of social systems that we're building in I saw some very useful indications around that. I think the COVID and the kind of health crisis has put up front the kind of critical foundational social systems, whether it's education or health, etc., and how do we advance those while kind of dealing with things that can, in a way, have kind of economic benefits. And the reason why I raise this is because fundamentally there's a difference in the role of the state in those two kind of domains, and how you then do the co-creation is useful. And then the final comment, and then I'll end off on this, was the kind of last session I attended, I think on international infrastructures, raised a very important comment about whether we in fact in this conference have been talking about innovation policy, or we're talking about policy in general. And whether it makes sense to talk about innovation policy, even the name transformative innovation policy. I think it's about sustainability transitions or something. Limiting it to an innovation policy space, I think has the unintended consequence of people thinking that this is about science, technology, and innovation as opposed to systems change. So I think that question was posed in the session but not answered, and I think it would be useful to still answer that question. Thanks.
Okay, well, so we've heard from the networking sessions, and we've heard from the networks, the associations that were involved in setting up this conference. And I think I can conclude there's a lot of appetite for follow-up. So I think that's very positive. But the question is, of course, how do we channel that appetite, and what kind of measures can we take? I think we need a period of a couple of months to explore this. So after this conference, I think the various associations and network can reflect on this, and Imran already talked that the governing board of TIPC will reflect on this. So the idea is that we come back with to you with a number of suggestions for how to continue, but after an exploration phase. BPG and some others have been very active setting up a Slack channel, and I think many people have already joined just to continue the discussion. So I think I would like to encourage everyone to join the Slack channel. It's for free, and you can participate in the discussions. We will also plan to publish a research agenda of some sort. Jonas and will be leading, but there's a number of people also from the various networks involved in developing this. And I think also it's very important that you, all the participants, can take initiatives and let us know. Of course, there need to be some coordination, and we have to see how we develop that. But overall, there's space for this. I think Diana will now come up also to present some ideas. Yes. And then I will do a thank you then after that. Okay.
Okay. Thanks, Johan. Well, I just want to give a glimpse of how we are closing the conference in terms of the platform and some numbers. Basically, so far until this morning, we had more than 800 people registered, but more importantly, we had more than 500 people using the platform with a profile within these 5 days of the conference. We had over
900 people viewing profiles of the different attendees and speakers. 50 conversations started in the connection feature that we had of the platform. We had 35 wall posts and 289 connections, people that connected with each other, not necessarily messaging or doing anything about it, but just at least a connection. There were 12 video chats between those connections that actually talk and use the video. And in total, over 2,000 engagement in the program sessions. That means that people coming in and out of the sessions and exploring the whole conference, which I think these are good numbers and show a little bit of what happened during this week. And related to what's coming afterwards, I just want to go back to the theory of change that guided our conference and just talk a little bit more about what we expect to do after the conference. As I said yesterday in our session, and we've highlighted through all the whole conference, this is just a milestone. Networks are important, and we saw today in the learning session, like there's a part of having the spaces, but also like having the driver, the interest to build these networks, not only to expand them, but to do something with the people that you connect, and that depends on us, basically. Then related to learning, we have gathered a lot of information from the different sessions, the chats, the observers with all of the input that they will have, also the guided reflections that we had through the surveys. So we will need to produce suitable formats to distribute that information along the participants and further. Those visions will be also displayed around, like with all of the different sessions that we had and the mechanisms to kind of capture that. Also what the conveners or hosts of each session has told us already through the surveys. And that all of those different mechanisms will provide some guideline and some other pathways for us to move forward towards our long-term goal, that is to build a sustainable and inclusive knowledge infrastructure for systemic transformation pathways. So now what we did with this conference and experimenting with this conference was to open up a space. It's up to us to think, to create new spaces for keep the conversation ongoing. And some particular ideas that come up and that Johan already said and that were exposed by each one of the networks, it's, well, we have a research and action agenda. So with all of these inputs, we will move forward to expand new pathways towards transformation. Then we have, from the TIPC side, a resource pack that it's being fed through the different experimental policy engagements, and we will share what we've learned in different global north, global south environments, and working with different socio-technical systems. And a specific handbook will be on as well about motion, a project with Climate Kick, and then I think that we'll put the link to a blog specifically related to this project in the chats if you want to know more about it. Also, I won't say much more about the further internetwork dialogues. I think that each of the networks express what we are doing and what we will keep doing between Eu-SPRI, STRN, Globalists, Africalics, but I would encourage other professional networks, other networks that have been represented and had sessions through the conference to also join in and ideate between all of us in different formats that we can keep collaborating and expanding our network. Related to researcher mobility schemes, basically it's like to take examples like what SPRI already does in terms of funding PhDs, but thinking between all of us, all the different organizations that have been representing the possibility of having visiting faculty positions between different organizations, not only, and I want to stress this, not only for research positions, perhaps, and also for practitioners and policymakers. And lastly, an idea to have a screen for research fellows or postdocs or even lecturers, professors, visiting fellows between different organizations, considering the TIPC organizations, Globalists, STRN. And this is an idea that was pitched actually in one of the sessions, in one of the learning or networking sessions, and that it's a good idea to move things forward. So basically, I'll end here saying that a journey once begun has no end. This is said by an Indian author, a novelist, Kiran Desai. So it's up to us how to move forward in what we want to do for the future.
Okay. So I have a very pleasant task, the last task to do, which is to say thank you. The only issue is that so many people to say thank you to, but we still think it's valuable to do that because there has been really a large set of people working with such dedication on making this conference possible. The first person I would like to mention is Natalie Algorani. She was the one who brought this network, this platform, into our radar and has started to investigate and critically contributed to building the platform. And she also has been in contact with many speakers before the conference, the training, using the platform. So we really owe her a big thank you. And then we had technical coordinators helping us in all the sessions. So Kazia Dibist, I may not pronounce all the names right. I apologize for that. Anisa Kuchuri, Eu-SPRI Trividi, and Jack Taylor. And in addition, we had Louisa King and Marta from Ingenio, I don't know her surname, sorry, and Yvonne Barnes from Sussex being involved. So they did a lot of the work behind the scenes. And then we had several committees. We had the experimental committee and the learning session facilitators. These were a bit connected. And so this is Vicky Shaw, Ed Steinmuller, Catherine Schiller, Edgar Sales Tirones, Sandra Boni, and Bipaji, of course, who led, in fact, the experimental committee, Andrea Padilla, and Jenny Witte. So there was a whole set of people busy trying to use the conference as a platform for learning how to conference. And this will also be reflected a bit in the resource pack we are building, this experience. There was a scientific committee that also has been very active, and many of the members were hosting the networking tables. So Jonas Torrens, Erika Kramer-Mabula, Anne Kinjiri, Katharina Schiller, again Edgar Sales Tirones, Bipaji Ghosh, Matthias Weber, Jordi Mollas Gallard, Maria Ackerman, and several other people in the scientific committee, like Chuck Daniels and Bruno Turnham and Diana Velasco. So people working, doing all this voluntary work in these committees, despite all the work constraints, of course, and other pressures. I think this is fabulous, and I think I hope you all appreciate this. And then we had other people working on administrative matters, like Pip Bolton, and the donations. There is an option to donate because we have not paid a fee. The donations will be used for follow-up activities for this conference. So please, you can still consider to donate. Go to the platform. You can do this. And then we had, of course, Geraldine Bloomfield, our communication manager of TIPC, who has been very active also in building the network, in sending messages, and Francisco Dominguez helping her out. We had people acted as moderators to various sessions, while they were not involved in proposing the sessions. Jordi Molas Gallard again, Paulina Terrazas, Rob Byrne, and Vicky Saul. Finally, I would like to thank the TIPC consortium members, specifically Jørgen Marklund, Eli Karjalainen, Imran Patel, and Elizabeth Gulbranson, because of their participation, but also because of the funding and the fact that they really support the TIPC process of building this inter-network dialogue. And here I also would like to mention Matthias Weber, who's very active in EU-SPRI, and also EU-SPRI has been financially supporting this event to make it possible not to ask for a fee. And of course also the networks like Globalists, Africa-Lips and STRN have been active to collaborate on this conference and follow-up activities. And finally, of course, we need to thank all the participants for contributing, discussing, but at the end, I think there were two persons that really driven this conference forward and who have been the main actors in making this possible. This is Diana Velasco, who was the academic lead, and Cristina Miriati, the project manager. I think their leadership has been outstanding. They have been the heart and the soul of the conference. So I would really like to thank them for all their dedication and work. Thank you. I think that's it. I mean, that's a bit about digital conferences. No hug, no flowers, but some smiles, and there are comments in the chat. So so you can leave. Everyone can leave more comments in the chat. You can leave that open a bit. But this is it. Bye bye, and thank you.